Order number 2, communication from the chair. Order number 3, messages. Order number 4, petitions. Order number 5, papers. Order number 6, notices of motion. Order number 7, questions and statements.
Now, honorable senators, at SBC yesterday, the indication was that we were expecting 2 CSs this morning for purposes of responding questions posed by honorable senators. During the day yesterday, the CS Gender, Culture and Arts called me that she will not be able to attend this session because at SBC we had indicated, having read through her letter, where she had indicated that she will be going to State House to brief His Excellency the President on matters touching on her ministry. As SBC, we indicated that she could go brief His Excellency the President at 9 and maybe appear before us at 11 a.m. However, she called me indicating that immediately after briefing His Excellency the President, she is supposed to proceed to the airport to catch a flight on official duties. And therefore, I found that very reasonable, and due to that reason, she is not here today for purposes of responding to that question. Number 25 by the Senator for Kirinyaga County, Senator James Murango, who in fact is not in the House. Now, as far as question 37 and 40 are concerned, we had no indication whatsoever when we sat as SBC as to whether the Honorable CS, who is the Prime Cabinet Secretary, will not be present for purpose of responding to those 2 questions. And therefore, the indication was that we were expecting the CS, the Prime Cabinet Secretary, to be before this House today for purposes of responding to those 2 questions. However, yesterday at 4 p.m., a letter was received by the Clerk of the Senate indicating that the Prime Cabinet Secretary would not be in a position to appear before the Senate for purposes of responding to those 2 questions. Now, honorable senators, I find the conduct of the Prime Cabinet Secretary unacceptable. If, having gone through the letter, there is no emergency, that reason given there, it's a reason that the Prime Cabinet Secretary knew long before that he will be undertaking the assignment indicated in that letter. And courtesy demands that he ought to have indicated the same to the Senate long before SBC sat to schedule these questions. So, honorable senators, as far as question time is concerned, we have no CS today for purposes of responding to any of those questions that had been slated for today. We will therefore proceed with the other business indicated in the order paper, unless, of course, the majority leader has something to share with the Senate. Proceed.
Mr. Speaker, this is a very grave matter, and I don't think the fact that the minister called you is sufficient. She may have called you maybe on matters to do with Kilifi County, but not with the Senate, because she is not invited here to come and meet the Speaker. And much as you extended courtesy of receiving her call, the minister needs to know that this House is terribly disappointed in her conduct. CS Aisha Jumwa, a long-serving parliamentarian who's been here in Parliament for over 10 years, knows very well that when there is a conflict of diaries between the executive and appearance in parliament, the legislature takes precedence. I know President William Ruto very well. If any minister were to tell him that I cannot make it to your meeting because I am scheduled to appear before parliament, he can never recall that minister to appear before them, either at cabinet or at an official briefing, at the expense of the representatives of the people. This behavior by CS Aisha Jumwa is something that I find quite astounding, because while ministers and her colleagues have been before this house 3, 4, 5 times, her and the Prime Cabinet Secretary are the 2 ministers that have never set foot in the Senate. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, I'd wish, with your guidance, and I'm willing to be persuaded by colleagues, maybe who you may grant an opportunity to say a thing or two about this, the conduct of these 2 ministers, Mr. Speaker, that let us be bound by the collective reasoning of the House, because it is not proper for, I have seen the letter from the office of the Prime Cabinet Secretary. There's an officer by the name Joseph N. Busiega. These are people who need not be in public offices, and I'm not excusing the Prime Cabinet Secretary. But by the time you're writing a letter at 3:57 p.m. for a meeting that is supposed to happen the following morning at 9 a.m., are you normal? Do you know what you're doing in that public office, Mr. Speaker? This cannot be entertained, and I cannot allow Parliament, Mr. Speaker, to be treated like this. Therefore, we have to register our disappointment with both ministers in the strongest terms possible, including the amendment that we have just done to the Powers and Privilege Act, Mr. Speaker. Unfortunately, the amendment is yet to become official law of the land, because it still has to go through the National Assembly, Mr. Speaker. But if it were up to me, we need to issue summons to both ministers, because first of all, we need to establish whether they recognize that Parliament is bicameral, and therefore, because I am sure they have appeared before our colleagues in the National Assembly, and therefore I don't get what the spite about the Senate is and what their motivation might be, Mr. Speaker. There is nothing that members are begging. You're coming to respond to issues of the representatives of the people, which the people of Kenya are asking you as a minister through their elected representatives in this House. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, I want to be guided by colleagues in their consideration of this matter, so that we make a decision jointly as a House on what to do. And finally, Mr. Speaker, we will eventually have to make a decision on the number of times a minister can skip appearance, and the maximum number they need to exhaust on postponement, especially postponement. We issued directives the other day on what is a standard letter that you write to Parliament. It cannot be you just say you can't appear, no suggestion when you are next available, no credible reason why you're not appearing. Therefore, without appearing to be lamenting, Mr. Speaker, I want to humbly request that we take a decision as a House on what to do with these 2 ministers. I thank you.
Senator Sifuna.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, you caught me just confirming with the law on whether this House can actually impose the same sort of sanctions that we've seen imposed by committees on witnesses who fail to appear before those committees. And I think I've said enough about CS Aisha Jumwa. And I have no more to say. As a legislator, you have advised us on more than one occasion that this cannot be a house of lamentations. So I think we need to proceed and impose a fine in accordance with the law for the non-appearance of the CS Aisha Jumwa. As to my brother, the Cabinet Secretary for Foreign Affairs, Musalia Mudavadi, I have never seen him in this house. since these rules were promulgated and the number of times that has been invited here. In fact, Mr. Speaker, I have the privilege of sitting on the SBC, and I remember one time he is the one who wrote a letter to this House saying that you cannot summon a cabinet secretary if there is only one question to answer, and that we should wait until there is enough material for him to be able to appear before this House. And I remember the direction that we took as SBC. We said it could be the most critical question in the country right now. And I want to thank some of the CSs who have appeared here. Last week, Honorable Speaker, the CS for Defense, Aden Duale, appeared to answer one question on the reopening of Uhuru Park. And I think he left everybody here satisfied. The people of Nairobi are happy. The park is now open. We cannot be told such stories, Mr. Speaker. And because you have directed us that we should not be a house of lamentations, I want the fate that befalls Aisha Jumwa to befall the CS for Foreign Affairs, so that he also feels the pinch. And I want to request that we expedite the changes that we made to the Parliamentary Powers and Privileges Act, so that, Mr. Speaker, the enhanced fine might be a dissuasion, or might dissuade some people from failing to appear before the Senate. Mr. Speaker, it has been a very difficult night here in Nairobi because we are trying to coordinate responses to incidents of flooding all across the city, and I'm sure this is a matter that everyone is aware of. But even though we did not get much sleep, we woke up in time to be able to be here this morning because we have critical questions to answer. And if you look at the range of questions and the discussion that we were to have here, especially on arrest, detention, and deportation of Kenyans in diaspora, these are critical matters, Mr. Speaker. I have a very critical case that has gone on, I think, since before the elections. One of our key supporters from Western Kenya, Professor Ruto, her son was arrested in the US during the crackdown on the opioid epidemic, Mr. Speaker. And he is a qualified doctor, pharmacist. And that young man has languished in jail at an undisclosed location, and we are unable to get any information on his whereabouts and whether he's okay. It would have been a nice opportunity for the CS who comes from that very same county where that young man comes from to give answers to the family of that young boy. So, Mr. Speaker, I express my disappointment, but I want us to proceed in line with the law and impose those fines and issue summons so that if they fail to appear, other consequences can follow. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Senator Mungatana.
Mr. Speaker, on my part, Mr. Speaker, I rise on defense of the Cabinet Secretary in charge of Foreign Affairs. Mr. Speaker, the Honorable Musalia Mudavadi was before our committee for delegated legislation 2 days ago. He came on time, waited, and we had to wait for quorum to form. He went to the office, he came back and appeared before us and tackled every question that we put before us, that we put before him. So I'm very surprised that today his behavior is totally different from what he displayed at the committee. And I know that the very heavy issue that we were tackling there, we were able to find a way forward. Mr. Speaker, having said all that, the issue I was trying to drive at is that there are some cabinet secretaries who have defied this House. And there are some cabinet secretaries who have been very cooperative with this House. Now, the question is, are we speaking with records? Are we speaking with facts? Mr. Speaker, I have a recollection of your ruling that guided that we should not be people to lament on issues. Instead, we should take action, which Honorable Sifuna has proposed. But the way you actually guided is not what the Honorable Senator is proposing. What you said is that a proper motion should be brought for us to censure. My own take, Mr. Speaker, is that nothing stops the majority leader, Mr. Speaker, from originating a letter
when he's giving his weekly statement, instead of just talking of how many questions we have done, how many statements we have done, what the committees have done, he should also say that there is this minister and that minister who never turned up, so that we have a proper record. And when we then move, we are all in agreement as a house that this particular minister didn't turn up, and in the weekly report by the majority leader, he didn't show up on this date, on this date, on this date, so that we can have a track, and then when we come, we pass a unanimous vote. But Mr. Speaker, the way it is that we are talking without really putting the facts on the table, it would not be helpful. So, Mr. Speaker, I am urging also action on the side of the majority leader to be mentioning these things. When he is doing that weekly report, he must also say the following ministers failed to turn up, so that we can note them, and then at the appropriate time, either him or the minority leader can bring a proper motion which should be unanimous, because we'll be referring to a record of absenteeism and failure to exercise duty. Mr. Speaker, as I sit down, I would urge the Cabinet Secretary in charge of Foreign Affairs. The question Honorable Kalwale is asking about deaths of people who are working outside in the Gulf states is a very relevant question, especially, Mr. Speaker, for those of us who come from the coast. All the 6 counties, Mr. Speaker, including Tana River County, there are many, many, many people who go to the Gulf and they do work there. And we have people who have suffered there. And I have some cases that I would have wanted to interrogate. I am